First of all, how does it feel to be honored by the Revolution Awards?
I mean, for me, to receive an award named for Ida B. Wells is a really big deal, and I'll talk about it a little bit tonight. But she's kind of she's the everything, right? So she's the social scientist and the journalist and kind of the brave activist voice. And she used to do foolish things like spend her whole check on nice bags and shoes. So I love Ida. She's extraordinary. So for me to receive an award named for Ida Wells is a huge honor.
Awesome. What do you feel is the state of journalism, and if there's a such thing as black journalism to you, what is the state of black journalism as well?
So I don't want to pass judgment on journalism because I'm not actually a journalist. And maybe that is an indication of the state of black journalism. And I think this is important. So I've been really honored about how kindly the NABJ has embraced me, the show, how supportive they have been professionally, because I'm not from the ranks of journalists. So, I kind of came in sideways, which is irritating. Like, I could imagine that for folks, many of whom are my colleagues, for example, in the NBC family, who are journalists, who are trained, who came through, local news and then kind of up through the ranks, that to watch somebody come in and get a national show basically from a college classroom could be irritating, and yet they've been super supportive. And I think there's a way in which black folks recognize that as long as we're being respectful of one another's work and acknowledging our weaknesses. So what I'll say is I'm not personally a journalist. Many of the women who work on my show producing are trained journalists, and we try to bring that journalistic ethic to what we're doing. But in the end, there's not enough diversity in newsrooms. There's not enough diversity behind the camera, let alone in front of it. And that impacts what all of us get to see and hear and what we think those news stories are.
Okay. How do you feel, there's this groundswell of, some would say the Black Lives Matter movement. What are your thoughts on that in general and how it has affected America all the way up to the presidential election?
Yeah. So I was asked to moderate a panel at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation event by John Lewis. And so anything John Lewis asked you to do, the answer is yes, sir. And so I went and moderated this panel. And on it, I asked John Lewis basically the same question. He had brought a bunch of Black Lives Matter activists, and I asked him, as a veteran of SNCC and of the civil rights movement, what he thought. And he said, more movements is always better, more disruption, more challenge, more change. And so my presumption is similar. I look at Black Lives Matter, I see imperfections, but I look at the civil rights movement, I see imperfections. I look at the anti-apartheid movement, I see imperfections. I look at Gandhi's movement of anti-imperialism against the British state, I see imperfections. It's the nature of mass-based social movements, but clearly more disruption, less status quo, more pushing back is relevant. What I will say is, I am disappointed that the Democratic Party could only produce, two baby boomer or older white folks to run for president. Demographic diversity is not the only kind that matters.
Yeah.
But wow, the GOP really kicked the Democratic Party's butt in just pure visual diversity.
Right.
And we should be appalled by that, and we should do better as a Democratic Party and as a country.
Gotcha. So are we, okay, you don't have to answer this, but are we screwed if Donald Trump becomes president? Should we all get our passports renewed?
No. Look, catastrophe is a very powerful media spin. And so the number of times, I'm now old, and so I have lived through a lot of elections where everybody's getting their Canadian passport. But our founders, for all of their failings, and they had plenty, really did create a system of checks and balances. They really did create a system where there are, we've never had a military coup. You really can't just come in and govern. Ask President Obama. You really do have to govern alongside. My biggest concern is actually with the Supreme Court. The next president is going to get at least 2, maybe as many as 4 justices. But honestly, I'm not sure that Donald Trump is my biggest worry about the Supreme Court. There are at least 2 Republicans who I am more worried about who they would put on the court than Mr. Trump. So I think that Mr. Trump's litmus test on the court would likely be fiduciary and fiscal and kind of opening up the floodgates of a lot of financial things, which could have very serious ramifications. But longer term, I don't think he has a Roe v. Wade litmus test as far as I can tell. He certainly hasn't said it. There are other Republicans running who do.
They've said that Trump is to soften you up to some of the others.
Yeah.
So. Okay. So I won't hold you, but since this is all hiphop.com, I have to get your views on hip hop, and if you will, perhaps the lack of diversity with the ladies, if you have an opinion.
Yeah, I just need more women's voices. So I run the Anna Julia Cooper Center at Wake Forest University, and what Anna Julia Cooper once said was, "Not the boys less, just the girls more." And so this is always my feeling with hip hop. I believe in the relative autonomy of art. And so I don't need art to be positive. Some of my favorite art is not positive, right? And so misogyny, all of those things, I mean, I work on reconciling them. We think about them. We talk about them. It's part of how you become a critical media listener, all of that. For me, the single biggest problem is I just need to hear more women's voices. And it's not because, again, when we look at who women are in hip hop, they don't, they're not like bringing flowers and lilies, right? It's just that sometimes, for example, so I think about Nicki's voice and how powerful it is to me, in part because Nicki plays these different roles. And so I like being able to move with her across gender identities. I like that Nicki will take your woman and your man, right? I like that Nicki can play soft, but she can also play hard. And I sometimes need a woman's voice to do that role for me in the way that like what music does in my life. I also just, again, I'm old, so I'm first generation hip hop, which means I also just think everything that exists now is whack in comparison. So one of my dates for tonight, I brought 2 of my favorite millennials with me. One of them is one of my producers, and she loves Kendrick Lamar. And we basically fight every day because I'm like, you only love Kendrick because you weren't alive for any of the actual good stuff. So,
right.
But I recognize that's also just a generational thing.
Right.
Yeah.
What's the hardest thing about your job?
The commute. I live in North Carolina during the week, so I'm in North Carolina Monday through Thursday, and then I fly to New York on Fridays. I'm here Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then I fly back. And I have a 14-year-old and a 2-year-old, and so that commute with 2 kids is a lot.
Right,
yeah.
I can imagine.